Have you been frustrated trying to get realistic weathering effects on the rolling stock on your model railroad? Well, I'm going to show you how to weather tank cars using an airbrush to get very realistic effects on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and if you'd like to see more videos about model railroading tips, tools, and techniques, then be sure and subscribe down below and click that little bell icon so you can catch every episode. Have you ever found yourself frustrated trying to get realistic weathering effects on the rolling stock on your model railroad? Weathering is one of those things that adds great realism to a layout, but can also be very frustrating when you're trying to get it right. A few weeks ago, I shared a video about weathering a covered hopper in N-scale. Many of you commented that you found that video very helpful. A few people noticed when I showed that covered hopper on my layout at the end of that video, the tank car next to it, and asked about how I weathered that tank car. Well, as I promised those people, today I'm bringing you a video about how I weather my tank cars. I think it's a technique that you'll find is fairly easy to do and achieves very realistic looking results. Before I get to that, I want to very briefly remind you to keep watching as I approach 1,000 subscribers, as I'm going to be hosting a contest with some prizes that I think all of you will find very interesting. So be sure and watch all my videos over the next couple of weeks, as we'll be announcing more details about how you can enter and what those prizes are going to be as I reach 1,000 subscribers. I also want to remind you about my upcoming monthly live stream. Over the course of the past couple of videos, many people have commented and said that they would be interested in participating in such a live stream. I want to pick a day and time that's going to be the most conducive for those who want to watch to be able to participate live, although all those live stream videos will also become videos on my channel, so if you miss one, you can watch it later. However, the shows will be much more interesting if we have a good live audience, so I want to pick the time that works best for most people. So if you would be interested in participating in that live stream, I'm going to ask you to leave a comment down at the bottom of the page and tell me what day and time works best for you. Now let's get over to the workbench and weather some tank cars. Today I'm going to be weathering these two 23,500 gallon tank cars. These are modern tank cars. These particular tank cars are produced by Atlas. And on my layout, these tank cars are going to be an asphalt service. With many kinds of freight cars, especially with tank cars, it's very helpful to know exactly what kind of service the car is going to be in, so you best know how to weather it. And that is definitely the true in this case and with tank cars in general. I'm going to be weathering these in a moderate weathering, not extremely heavy, but I also don't want them to look too new either. I want them to look like they've been in service for a while. If you look at pictures of tank cars that have weathered over time, you'll notice, first of all, the fade of the paint. And specifically what you'll notice is the paint will fade to a almost bluish gray over time, and it will tend to fade more, obviously, from about mid-car up. Maybe the top 2/3 of the car. The bottom of the car doesn't see as much sun, so naturally the paint doesn't fade as quickly. The first step in the weathering process for these cars is going to be to fade the paint on the upper 2/3 of the car. And to do that, I'm going to be using a Tester's light ghost gray color in a wash, just a very thin wash. We're going to apply it very lightly and gently, a little bit at a time, to fade all of the paint, but fade it a little more on the upper part of the car. The second thing you notice on tank cars is rust patterns. Tank cars will tend to rust, obviously much more along the top of the car, where water will tend to stand and stay on the car longer. And then also sometimes you'll get some rust along the bottom of the car in streaks, where water runs down the car and hangs on the bottom of the car, and also where you get some splash up from underneath the car. Cars that have been in service for a long time, older cars, you'll see some of those rust streaks along the very bottom of the car. You don't see a lot of rust on the sides of the car, except in streaks often. Unless it's a very old car, usually just some streaks from the top. So on this one, I'm going to be applying some rust, some general rust along the tops of the car, a light coat, and just some light streaks, especially down the seams of the car. Just very light. I want to understate the rust on these cars. And then the final thing that you see on many tank cars is spillage. And as I said, these are going to be an asphalt surface. So I think on both of these, I'm going to put just a little bit of spillage down right along the center of the car, along the ladders and right in that loading area. Again, they're going to be an asphalt surface. So I'm going to use an oily black for the streaks down the side of the car for the spillage. I didn't say what color I was going to use for the rust. I'm going to be using a roof brown for the rust. Don't want these to be too red. I want them to look like they've been rusting lightly and slowly over time, like it's older, darker rust. So that roof brown is what I'm going to be using. Now, to get started, I need to disassemble these cars first. As you've seen before, I use about anything to help keep parts organized. Today I'm going to be using this little, this is a little baby food container, and I'm going to use it to help keep my bolster pins in place. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these trucks. So these are pin-mounted trucks, and so I'm going to use a precision screwdriver and just very carefully pry the pins out of these bolsters on these trucks. I want to be very careful with this because this has some very fine brake hose detail along the sides. Now I'm going to put the pins in my little cup here, but I'm going to do something else with the trucks in just a moment. Now I've got the trucks removed. I'm going to go ahead and put my trucks into this painting jig that I use for painting and weathering trucks. A new technique that I just learned. I actually learned from Cody Grivno on Model Railroader video very recently. And this is a technique that only works if you're planning to replace these plastic wheel sets. I'm going to be upgrading these plastic wheel sets to metal wheel sets. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the wheel sets in these trucks as I put them into my painting jig. And what that will do is it'll allow the plastic wheel sets to mask the axle pockets in the trucks themselves, so I won't get paint inside of those axle pockets whenever I go to airbrush or spray paint these trucks for weathering. And so I'm going to do just that. I'm going to stick the trucks in here with the wheel sets in place. Now, if you were going to use the plastic wheel sets, if you're not going to replace them, you don't want to do this. Because the paint will make a mess out of your wheel sets. You'll get it on the treads, and you'll have a mess. Plus, you also run the risk of getting the paint into where the axle pins go into those axle pockets and gumming them up, and you permanently ruining the ability of those wheels to turn. But I'm going to be replacing the wheel set, so I'm going to leave these in there to allow them to keep paint from getting inside of those pockets. I'm going to set this aside, and we'll come back to weathering the trucks and couplers a little bit later. When I did my recent weathering video on weathering a Burlington Northern boxcar, there were two questions that I was asked repeatedly about that particular video. One was, why didn't I wash the model before I started the weathering process? And the second question was, why didn't I wear gloves when handling the model through that process? And I have to respond to that by saying, one, you're right, I didn't do either of those things in that video. Two, those are both very good ideas. Anytime you're painting or weathering a model, it's a very good idea to wash it, to get oils, fingerprints, dirt, anything that might interfere with your painting or weathering off of it. And it is a very good idea to wear gloves to keep from getting fingerprints on it. I will admit that sometimes in haste, I forget to do those things or just don't do them, and I didn't on that video, but it is a good practice. So we're going to do exactly that today. Now that I've got my models disassembled, I'm going to start by putting them in a little bit of, this is soapy water. It's just slightly warm, very little bit of soap. In fact, I put a drop of soap in and then I washed most of it out. I don't need much soap. It still has quite a bit of suds to it. And then I'm using just a moderately soft artist paintbrush, and I'm just going to scrub this model down a little bit Again, I'm using a soft bristled brush because I want to be very careful about the very fine detail on this model. Don't want to break anything. But I'm going to brush this just to get off any dirt. These models have actually been on my layout for some time, even though they had not been upgraded or weathered. And so I dusted them before I even started any of this process. But this will get any dust and dirt that's left on them off, and also wash away any fingerprints. So we're just going to brush it gently but well with this brush in this soapy water. And then I've got some clear water over here. I'm just going to come over here and give it a couple of dunks in the clear water, and then set it on a paper towel to dry. And we're going to let those air dry on my paper towel. And once those have dried, we will come back and we can begin our weathering process. While we're waiting for our freshly washed tank cars to dry, we can go on to the first step in weathering our trucks and couplers. Again, this is a new technique that I just learned from Model Railroader magazine, a video on their website by Cody Grivno, and I'm hoping that it's going to work out really well. The first step in this process is going to be to give them a good coating of Tester's Dull Coat. This is going to give the weathering a little tooth, a little something to stick to on the on this very difficult to paint plastic that trucks are made out of. And so we're going to give them just a good spray on the sides of the trucks and also on the faces of the couplers as well. So let me turn on the fan in my spray booth and we'll get started. And that should be all that they need. We will let those dry, and we'll come back and check on those a little bit later whenever we're ready to do some weathering. This is a great time for me to show you a little tool that I have developed that helps me in painting my N-scale rolling stock, especially tank cars. And that's this simple little block of wood that I have drilled 2 holes in at the exact distance apart as the bolster pins on the car that I'm painting. And then I cut off a pair of bamboo shish kebab skewers and glued them with a pointy end sticking up in each of those 2 holes. And I can take a car like this tank car and literally just set these pins in the bolster holes, and I've got a great handle for painting the car. And I can use the base to turn and get to the car as I need to. I can get somewhat underneath it by simply tilting it just a little bit. Now, one thing you want to make sure of if you use this technique, make sure you use a board that's plenty wide. This is a 1x3. I definitely would not use anything any narrower than that. You don't want the model to blow over as you are airbrushing it. And also, you don't want to make your pins too tall. These are almost taller than they need to be. They're about 2 inches tall above the surface of the board. About 1.5 inches would have been plenty, but this will work. So this is a handy little tool that I use. Now I'm going to be beginning with my fade coat, and I've taken that light ghost gray by Model Masters. I thinned it about 50-50 with 70% isopropyl alcohol, and I'm going to be using my Badger 200, which is a single action but internal mix airbrush. I really like this airbrush for weathering because I can control exactly how much paint is going on and set it and get exactly the same amount of paint with every stroke. I can set a very light trace amount with this and get very great control. I have a double action airbrush that I use for other types of application, but when it comes to weathering, my Badger 200 is my kind of my go-to airbrush. So I'm going to get ready to put a fading coat on this. So you're going to hear my air compressor and also the fan in my paint booth here in just a moment, so you'll excuse the noise. And I'm going to try to stay out of the way so you can see what I'm doing as much as possible in the camera, so you can see how this fade coat goes on. I'm going to begin by putting a little paint on a piece of paper here on the side of my paint booth so I can get a sense of just how much paint is going on to get my airbrush set the way I need it. We want just a very light trace amount to go on at a time with this, so I want to make sure that I get this set down very fine. Okay, I think I've got that right where I want it now. And we're going to begin. Again, we want to fade more as we go up, but I want to get a light fade even on the bottom, just to dull the paint. So I don't know how much you can even tell with the camera that this is going on, but mostly we're going to just dull and fade this paint. I'm painting at about 15 to 18 psi with my compressor with this kind of wash color, and I think you can begin to see there how that's faded compared to the other side. You see that is pretty starkly black, and we've got just a little bit of fade on this. Now I'm going to keep fading this as I go up, so I'm going to kind of work the middle and towards the top and keep fading it just a little bit. I don't want to do too much on the top because I'm going to hit the top also from this side. So again, the same way, a little bit from the bottom, work my way up, and then I'm going to start more in the middle and work my way up. I don't want this effect to be too strong, so again, I want to work just a little bit at a time. And there we're getting a little bit of fade compared to the black of the end to the side. You see, we're getting a little bit of fade. I'm going to do just a little bit on the ends also. Okay, this end too. Again, you want to work very slowly with a fade coat like this, or as with any kind of weathering. You can easily get too much very quickly, so you want to work just a little bit at a time. You can always add more paint. It's very difficult to take paint off once you put it on the airbrush like this. So just a little bit at a time. Very light passes, very light coats. And I think that's going to do it for that car. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a close-up so you can see better what it looks like here. And there's more of a close-up. You can kind of see the color on the bottom of the car as opposed to the color as I tilt it around towards the top. Just a nice light fade. Here I wanted to give you just a little bit of a side-by-side comparison before I weather my second car. This is the tank car that I just faded, and this is the one that I haven't faded yet. And you can see the difference is subtle, but it's definitely there. And this definitely gives the sense of a car that has been in service for a while already, just by fading the paint a little bit. It's been a couple days since I did the fade coat on my two tank cars, and so they've had plenty of time for the paint to completely dry. As you can probably see, I hope you can see in the camera, the tank car on the right, I faded just a little bit more than the tank car on the left. I'm going to come back now and do a rust coat on these two tank cars. And since I faded the one on the right a little bit more, I'm also going to rust it a little more. And then ultimately I'm going to add some spillage streaks to the one on the right. I think I've decided I'm not going to add any streaks to the one on the left. But I'm going to add a little bit of spillage down the sides of the one on the right. But right now I'm going to be working on the rust coat on the tops of these cars and a little bit along the bottoms, and also some splash up on the ends from where the wheels would splash that up. For my rust coat, today I am using, I've got some old polyscale Denver and Rio Grande Western Building Brown left around. And it's it's kind of an older rust color. It might be a little bit light, and if it's a little bit light in color, if it's a little bit too fresh looking, then I'll come back and darken it with maybe some railroad tie brown and a little bit. But we're going to start with this, and this is diluted about 50-50 with alcohol, 70% isopropyl alcohol. So it's kind of a wash, kind of a thick wash, really, pretty well thinned paint. We're going to be putting this on very light coats and building it up very slowly. Again, I'm using my Badger 200 airbrush. So I'm going to start with this one on the left that I'm not going to weather quite as heavily. I'm going to start with it, and we'll build this paint up slowly. And we're just going to slowly build up the paint on the top where the rust would be along the top of this car. There, I think you can get a sense of that. I actually got a little more rust on that than I had intended to, but it's got a pretty good look to it. I'm going to make a few rust streaks down the seams in this as well, just a little bit. There you can see you get just some light rust streakage down the seams on the car, and a little more of an even coatage of rust on the very top. Okay, now that the rust coat on our two tank cars has had a chance to dry for a little bit, I'm coming back with a little bit of polyscale dirt, and this is thin just a little bit, but it's pretty good thickness of paint. I paint about 3 parts paint to 1 part alcohol here, and we're going to use this just to put some dirt splash up streaks on the ends of the cars. Just a small detail, but it really adds to the realism of the car. We want to line these streaks up with approximately where the wheels would be on the next car, on the trucks, because literally what this is going to be is some streaks that would be caused by splashing up of dirt, rust, dust, whatever that the wheels would throw up on the car in front or behind. So we're just going to add these on the edges, just some streaks up and down from the bottom, going up the ends of the car. Again, a little bit goes a long way here. You don't want to overdo this effect, just a little bit. Okay, there we go. So you get some nice streakage just up the outsides of the cars, like it would be splashed up by the wheels. And while I've got this earth color here, put just a light streaking along the very bottom of the car where some dirt and grime would splash up. Just a light streak or two kind of along the bottom of the car. Okay, now I've mixed up a little bit of Steam Power Black. This is kind of a oily, greasy kind of a black color. And to simulate asphalt, I think this will work really, really well. And I'm going to put just a little bit of asphalt spillage down from the cap of this tank car, from the dome, So it'll basically go kind of right down the ladder and the sides of the ladder here, just a little bit on each side. Doesn't take much of this to go a long way, this spillage. So we're just going to add just a little bit here to add some interest to this car. Okay, so very easy, very gently, just right down from the dome, right down the ladder. I think you see we got a nice streak. There we go. Now, on this one, I think I'm not going to put the streakage down the sides, but I am going to just touch the top a little bit. Right around the dome itself. Maybe even get a little bit of that on the walkways and the roof area, just to tone down a little bit of that rust around that area. This is the one that kind of got over rusted, so a little bit of this may kind of tone that rust down just a little. And here are my two tank cars with the weathering done on the tanks themselves. Now, some of your tank cars you may not want to weather quite this much. You can do the same effects, just do them a little lighter, a little less if you want to make a newer tank car. And I'll show you some where I have done just that before this video is finished. Now that we've got the tank car bodies finished, we're going to pay just a little bit of attention to the trucks and couplers. And I'm going to paint these with an airbrush using the same colors that I used on the tank cars. I'm going to use the Denver and Rio Grande brown for the couplers. Going to use a thin wash on those, build it up very slowly because I don't want to get paint in such a way as to hamper the function of the couplers inside of the draft gearboxes or the knuckles themselves. We're going to just build that color up just very slowly to give them a nice little rusted look. And then we're going to use that earth color as a wash on the sides of the trucks. When we started this process, I painted these with dull coat, you'll remember, which will help the paint to stick to this otherwise hard to paint plastic. So anyway, let's get our airbrush out and start working on these and see what they look like. With the trucks and couplers dry, I'm going to come back and paint the trip pins, which of course are made to simulate the brake line hoses on the train. So we want them to be black, and they've got this rusty paint on them from weathering the couplers. So I'm going to come back and touch them up using the same steam-powered black that I used before on the tank cars whenever I was simulating some spillage, and a fine micro brush. I'm just going to go over each one and make it black again, that kind of shiny oily black that you get with the steam powered black. Now I'm ready to weather and then install the new wheel sets. Now, I showed you on the last video where I weathered a hopper, covered hopper, how to measure the wheel sets with a caliper to make sure that you get the right length of axle, because there are a number of different axle lengths that are available. You want to make sure you have the right axle length and the right wheel size, and that's really a subject for another video. You can check out that other video about checking the wheel length, and I'll talk about wheel size in another video later. I'm going to weather the faces of these just to rust them a little bit. I'm going to use this same Denver and Rio Grande Western building brown that I used before, And again, just a fine micro brush, and you just want to get the faces of the wheel set of the wheels without getting any paint on that on the end of the axle itself, or it will cause the wheel not to roll properly. So just a nice coating on the wheel faces like that, and we'll do both wheels on every wheel set here. If you get used to doing this, you can get to where you can put the micro brush in there in just the right place, and then just spin the wheels in your fingers and like that, and get a good coating on there. And again, you can do that pretty easily if you're careful, without getting any wheel on the. You don't want to get paint on the treads or on the point of the axle, the end of the axle itself. So you don't need to watch me do all of these. I'll get these weathered, then we'll come back and be ready to reassemble our car. With the weathering all done, and with the trucks reassembled with my freshly painted metal wheel sets, we're ready to reassemble the cars. And so these Atlas cars have just friction pins that hold the trucks into the bolsters. And so I like to put the pin, it's easiest to put the pin in the truck and then fit it into the hole in the bolster, and just light pressure until you get it in place. You want it to turn easily. You don't want it to be able to rock and roll too much laterally. Okay, there is one car. And here's the finished product on my layout. You can see the weathering came out very nicely, and all the details really pop. Get a sense of the fact that this is a car that's been on the rails for several years. And with the weathering in the scenery, makes the cars look very natural on the railroad. These cars were weathered on what I would consider a moderate to heavy level. But here is a car that I weathered previously that is a little more lightly weathered, and you can get a sense that you can use these exact same techniques to weather a car, whether you want it to look like it's been on the rail for many years or even just a few months. All you can do is vary the amount of weathering that you put on. And so I hope you'll give these techniques a try. I think that you'll find that you can get some very nice effects to weathering your tank cars with just a little bit of patience and some practice with your airbrush. Well, you can see how with just some very basic airbrushing skills, you can weather tank cars with some very realistic effects. The most important keys are to be sure and build up your colors slowly so you don't over-weather your car. But with just a little bit of practice, I know you can use this technique with great effect. I hope that you'll give this technique a try, and when you do, be sure and leave me a comment and let me know how it goes. I hope you've enjoyed this video today. If so, please give it a thumbs up down below. Be sure and leave me a comment or a question down at the bottom of the page. And when you do, remember to tell me what day and time would work best for you if you participate in my live stream. If you found this video helpful, be sure and share it on your social media or model railroad forums that you participate in so others can enjoy this and other episodes of Ron's Trains and Things as well. Finally, be sure and check out that expanded description down below. There you can learn more about my layout. You can see my Amazon pick of the week. There might be something that you find interesting there. And you can learn how you can support Ron's Trains and Things through my Patreon or PayPal Me accounts. Well, that's all I have for today, but be sure and be watching for details about that 1,000 subscriber contest, and join me next Tuesday for my next modeling segment, and I look forward to seeing you then.